Hello, this is Sandy, and this is Sandy's History. And today we're going to be talking about America's involvement in the Middle East. Now, I have to admit that when I think of all the complications of that subject, I get a headache. So what I'm going to do today is focus primarily on two wars that the United States has been involved in Iraq. One led by George Herbert Walker Bush, and one led by George W. Bush, his son. The first is oftentimes called the Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War, sometimes Iraq War Number 1, and then the second of George W. Bush is sometimes called just simply the Iraq War. But before that, let me give you some context. If you look at a map of the Middle East, you will see Iran in the east and Saudi Arabia in sort of the southwest, and in the center is Iraq. Iran is a predominantly Shiite Muslim country, and Saudi Arabia is a predominantly Sunni Muslim country. And Iraq is in between and has populations that are sometimes Sunni and sometimes Shiite. For the most part, they've been able to get along well together up until the Second Gulf War. These lines dividing the countries were put in place shortly after World War I, when the nations of England and France, particularly the victors in World War I, divided up the Middle East among themselves. So France, in effect, got Syria and Lebanon, and England became the dominant power in Iraq and Palestine. Some people suggest, and I think there's a strong argument supporting this, that these lines were designed particularly to maintain instability in the Middle East, with the idea that Western powers would be able to dominate economically and politically in the region, and thus be able to maintain its oil supply. The map of the Middle East was further complicated by the establishment of the nation of Israel. After World War II, many nations, many peoples called for the establishment of a nation state, a homeland for the Jews. In large part, I think feeling guilty that many nations had done nothing to stop the Holocaust, and with the idea that if the Jewish people had a nation they could call their own, they'd have international political power and perhaps be able to protect themselves from future Holocausts. The establishment of Israel in the middle of all these Muslim countries created conflict immediately. Immediately there was a war between Israel and its Muslim neighbors that has continued off and on ever since, despite the efforts of leaders like Jimmy Carter, who established a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel in the Camp David Accords. Our efforts to establish peaceful relations between Israel and the Muslim countries has not been very successful. Now, ideally, America's policy has been, and sometimes actually is, that we have tried to maintain a stance of neutrality between the Islamic countries and Israel, trying to support their interests, both of their interests, as much as we possibly could. There are reasonable reasons for this. There are many Jewish voters in the United States who would throw out any politician who was ostensibly against Israeli interests. And we have an interest in maintaining our relations with the oil suppliers in the Muslim countries in the Middle East. So, to a large extent, we've tried to maintain good relations with both Israel and its Muslim neighbors. And this is a policy that has been successful at times, at other times not successful. I think clearly during George W. Bush's administration, this policy was not followed as we tilted more toward Israel and against our Muslim allies, and particularly in the President administration, been very anti-Muslim entirely. Now, the United States has been successful in at least appearing to avoid involvement in the Middle East up until the latter part of the 20th century. Dwight David Eisenhower was confronted with a plea from England and France to get involved in what was called at the time the Suez Crisis, when these nations invaded Egypt. I think Dwight David Eisenhower was wise in keeping the United States out of that conflict and being able to maintain the semblance of good relations with the nations in the Middle East. In 1979, this was no longer possible. In 1979, the Shah of Iran, the leader of Iran, came to the United States for treatments for his cancer, which ultimately proved to be fatal. But in his absence, the Ayatollah Khomeini came to power, a radical Islamic fundamentalist, and established a theocratic state in Iran. At the same time, students at the local university in Tehran swarmed over the U.S. Embassy and held the embassy for over a year, with 52 Americans held hostage. This failure of Jimmy Carter's administration to liberate our hostages in Iran, I think ultimately spelled the doom of Jimmy Carter's presidency. He was not able to win a second term in office, and Ronald Reagan became president after the election of 1980. Fast forward to the presidency of George Herbert Walker Bush, the former vice president of Ronald Reagan. In 1991, Saddam Hussein in Iraq invaded the small country of Kuwait. He did this primarily to gain control of its oil supply, and probably through diagonally drilling beyond the borders of Kuwait into the oil supply of Saudi Arabia as well. And he'd have access now to the Persian Gulf. The United States immediately saw this as a threat, and George H.W. Bush was successful in putting together a multinational coalition to push Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. He started with a bombing campaign that lasted over a month and knocked out the communications grid and the electrical grid in Iraq, and then launched a ground invasion of U.S., English, Saudi Arabia, and other nations' forces that very quickly pushed the Iraqi army out and ultimately crushed the Iraqi army. The Iraqi army fled from Kuwait, leaving tanks, arms in the desert as they fled north to Baghdad. I think every historian would agree that this was a great success. We went in quickly, accomplished what we wanted to accomplish, which was to remove Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. We had broad international support. We knew what the goal was. We accomplished the goal, and we got out quickly with minimal U.S. casualties. In all of this, I think George H.W. Bush had learned the lessons of Vietnam and the Powell Doctrine. Now, many people have criticized George W. Bush for not going into Iraq and eliminating Saddam Hussein, removing him from power, and placing a new governor and perhaps a new system of government in Iraq. In effect, they say he only did half the job. Now, I'd like to read to you what his response to this was. Later on, he wrote a book with his National Security Advisor, Brent Scowcroft, in which he said the following: "While we hoped that popular revolt or a coup would topple Saddam Hussein, neither the U.S. nor the countries of the region wished to see the breakup of the Iraqi state. We were concerned about the long-term balance of power at the head of the Persian Gulf. Trying to eliminate Saddam, extending the war into an occupation of Iraq, would have violated our guideline about not changing objectives in midstream, engaging in, quote, mission creep, and would have incurred incalculable human and political costs. We would have been forced to occupy Baghdad and, in effect, rule Iraq. The coalition would have instantly collapsed, the Arabs deserting it in anger, and other allies pulling out as well. Under those circumstances, furthermore, we had been self-consciously trying to set a pattern for handling aggression in the post-Cold War world. Going in and occupying Iraq, thus unilaterally exceeding the UN's mandate, would have destroyed the precedent of international response to aggression we had hoped to establish. Had we gone the invasion route, the US could conceivably still be an occupying power in a bitterly hostile land. It would have been a dramatically different and perhaps barren outcome. Well, George H.W. Bush's fears were ultimately realized by his son. But I think it's worth pointing out some of the main points that he makes in this. In the post-Cold War world, George H.W. Bush had hoped to establish a new pattern of relationships between the states. No longer would the world be divided into America and American allies who favored capitalism and democracy on the one hand, and Russia and its allies who had a totalitarian communist regime on the other. So no longer would the world be a dualistic world, it would be a multipolar world, a world in which there would be many nations who would work together to establish hopefully peaceful relations to end conflicts. And if that was unavoidable, as it was in the case of the Persian Gulf War, then a very multinational approach to resolve the conflict quickly. In addition, he was afraid that if America went into Iraq, they would have to establish a new government there. And how do you build a government from scratch? He did not see that as a possibility in Iraq. And finally, I think most importantly, he recognized that taking over Iraq would transform the balance of power in the region and create instability that would be a long-lasting problem in the world and in the United States. Taking another leap in time to the presidency of George H.W. Bush, the son of George W. Bush, on the day of 9/11/2001, I think we all know the basic facts of the events that happened that day. 19 Islamic terrorists boarded airplanes in New York and New England and flew 2 of them into the World Trade Center in New York. A third plane went into the Pentagon outside of Washington, D.C. And the fourth plane, passengers recognized what was going to happen and fought for control of the airplane with the terrorists, and the airplane ultimately went down in a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. Over 3,000 people died on that day. In the days after 9/11/2001, George W. Bush rallied America behind him and began an invasion of Afghanistan. This was a very rational thing to do. Afghanistan was where Osama bin Laden had made his home ground and where he was training Al-Qaeda and terrorists to attack America and American interests around the world. We went in and ultimately got caught in a quagmire there. We still have forces in Afghanistan with no apparent way to get out. Osama bin Laden escaped across the border into Pakistan. He was ultimately hunted down by American forces during Barack Obama's presidency. The biggest mistake George W. Bush made was his decision to invade Iraq. Iraq, he said, was complicit in the attacks on America in 9/11, which was not the case. There was no coordination between Iraq and Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden. And Bush and his administration also said that it had access to weapons of mass destruction, probably chemical weapons, perhaps nuclear weapons. Both of these ultimately turned out to be misstatements. When I say misstatements, I think you can interpret that any way you like. Probably the real reason we went into Iraq was because there was a philosophy established by many of Bush's allies, people who were called neoconservatives, that if we could establish a regime favorable to the United States, a democratic regime in Iraq, that the idea of democracy would spread throughout the Middle East. The philosophy was that democratic nations do not make war on other democratic nations. So by putting in place a government in Iraq, we would in effect be solving problems throughout the whole of the Middle East. Probably a more significant motive for our invasion of Iraq was to gain access of the Iraqi oil supply. One of the biggest criticisms of Bush's invasion of Iraq was that the war in Iraq was a preemptive war. In other words, a war without an immediately preceding event that aroused American attention, that threatened American lives, that ended in American deaths. We had no very specific incident that led to American involvement in the war. This led many people to question what was the nature of a just war. Under what conditions is it just, is it legal to enter into a military conflict? And the most basic component of a just war was that there be some immediate incident that caused a national security threat to occur. This was not the case in the Iraq War. And so there was very little international support for America's invasion of Iraq. And domestically, there was a lot of controversy about whether America should be involved in Iraq or not. Having gone in, we made almost every mistake possible. We did not understand the basic nature of the country. We did not understand the conflict between Sunnis and Shiites. One of the biggest mistakes was what was called de-Baathification. In other words, Saddam Hussein's government was dominated by people in the Ba'athist Party, B-A''Athis, the Ba'athist Party. So the United States had a policy of de-Baathification. In other words, removing all the Ba'athists from the government. So in effect, wiping out the government entirely. So the question was, what was going to replace the government? And the Americans had no quick solution to that, and was searching for some kind of replacement for months to follow, during which time there erupted conflicts between Sunnis and Shiites and American forces and American interests. One of the most critical elements of de-Baathification was the disbanding of the army. This was a critical mistake. The army could have been an instrument that Americans could use to maintain order in Iraq. But what we did was let loose thousands of young men who had access to military training with no organization. Chaos erupted through all of Iraq, and the United States had no way to control the looting of stores, the looting of historic cultural sites and museums. This reminded Colin Powell of what he called the Pottery Barn rule. According to the Pottery Barn, if you break it, you own it. If you break it, you've bought it. And we essentially broke Iraq. It was now ours, and the question was what to do with it. And we had no plan. We really had no plan about what to do with the country after we had conquered it. The Bush administration did not know the extent of the problem that confronted them. Within the first month of our involvement, George Bush flew to an aircraft carrier in the Pacific Ocean and gave a speech to the troops in which there was a banner flying overhead, mission accomplished. Well, mission was not accomplished and still is not accomplished in Iraq. Almost everybody would agree today was a complete failure. It destroyed the possibility of his father's idealistic coalition of nations. And it destroyed the balance of power in the Middle East, something that the world is still suffering from. George Bush, because of his failure in Iraq and because of his mishandling of the Hurricane Katrina and the economic crisis of 2008, which largely came about from a government conservative economic policies of deregulation. For all these reasons, George W. Bush is sometimes considered one of the worst presidents the nation has ever had. I would say the worst president of the United States up until 2016. Thank you for watching.